Well, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Monica Wedlock Kilpatrick, and I serve as the Associate Vice President of Organizational Development for the National Benevolent Association of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. As we get started, I would like to inform you that this webinar is being recorded and will be available for future viewing on the NBA website at nbacares.org. This webinar is part of our 2020 NBA webinar series. Today's topic is the rising number of incarcerated women. A November 2018 report by the Prison Policy Initiative estimated that approximately 219,000 women are currently incarcerated in the United States. This number is at a historic high for the country, and at NBA, we want to talk about how to change that. During this webinar, we will work to answer a few questions, such as why are there so many women now being incarcerated in the United States? What are the effects upon communities and their families? How can this trend be stopped? This webinar will discuss the impact of the increasing number of women, particularly women of color, that are spending time behind bars and work to address some solutions. Some attention will also be given to the impact of COVID-19 on this vulnerable population. This webinar, we hope, will be used as a tool for discussion and a call to action in congregations, regions, general church ministries, and in other communities. At the end of this presentation, there will be a time for questions. So throughout the webinar, if you have questions that emerge, we welcome you to use the Q&A feature by clicking on the icon at the bottom of the screen to submit any questions. Please include your email address if you so choose, so that if we are not able to get to your question, we can follow up with you directly after the webinar is over. To request technical assistance, you may also use the Q&A feature. Again, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available for future viewing on the NBA website in the coming weeks. To begin, let me introduce our speakers. Dr. Jennifer Ortiz is the Assistant Professor of Criminology at the University of Indiana Southeast. Dr. Ortiz's research interests center on punishment in the criminal justice system from sentencing through re-entry. She earned her doctorate in criminal justice from John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And before joining the IUS faculty, Dr. Ortiz served as research director for the New York State Permanent Commission on Sentencing from 2011 to 2015. She is a highly sought speaker and workshop leader in the field of criminal justice. She also serves on the board of Mission Behind Bars and Beyond, an NBA Incubate and Connect partner. We also have our very own Reverend Dean Bucalis, who's the mission specialist for the NBA Prison and Jail Ministries group. He was ordained in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and has served as pastor of congregations in Kentucky, Illinois, and Indiana. He's the founding pastor of New Life in Christ Christian Church, a Disciples of Christ congregation inside a women's re-entry facility in Louisville, Kentucky. He currently serves as the executive director of Mission Behind Bars and Beyond, an ecumenical re-entry program that trains small faith-based groups to work with returning citizens upon their release from prison. At this time, I will turn our presentations over to Jennifer and Dean. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Monica. It's a pleasure to be a part of this webinar. It's an important topic. As Monica mentioned, one of the things that I do is working with a re-entry program for men and women, but particularly for women who are located in a detention facility here in Louisville, Kentucky. And what we noticed over the past several years is the increased number of women who are being incarcerated and are also in places of detention across the country, not only in prisons and jails, but also in immigration detention centers. And so we're delighted today to add to our webinar series this topic and to have as our presenter Dr. Jennifer Ortiz, who has expertise in this area, also serves on our board at Mission Behind Bars and Beyond. I think this timely topic is one that we all need to be aware of and it's something that we can do, make some changes with respect to the circumstances that exist across our country with the disproportionate number of people of color and now of women who are being incarcerated. So I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer and thank her for being here with us.
Well, thank you, Dean. I want to thank the National Benevolent Association and Reverend Dean for thinking of me for this important presentation. I also want to thank all of you who are watching right now for choosing to attend today. Our topic for today is an important and often overlooked area of the criminal justice system, and that is women, but particularly women and incarceration. And so I always like to begin my presentations with an overview of what you can expect. So I'm going to begin by giving you a brief explanation of the problem using statistics. I have quite a few graphics throughout this PowerPoint. The PowerPoint will be made available to you after this, so don't feel the need to copy down every word from the graphics. But I'll start off with statistics. And after I go through that, I'll provide some information about why this is happening. So what are the factors contributing to this dramatic increase in female incarceration? I'm then going to explore a little bit about how incarcerating women at high rates impacts families. I think that's a really important piece, especially for those of us in the faith community. Sometimes the families are left outside, and that's the best way for us to help. I'll then move on to how it is that all of us can come together and try to address these issues. How can we reform it? I plan to speak for about 35 minutes, and then which will allow ample time for question and answer. So I'll start off with this. This is a pretty simple graphic to illustrate the growing problem. So this represents female incarceration rates in the United States from 1925 to 2015. And it's broken down by the federal prison population, which you'll notice in yellow, the local jail population, which is in light orange, and the state prison population, which is in dark orange. The number of women in jail, as you can see, is the fastest growing population, and that will become important later on in this presentation. But you should notice that between 1925 and 1975, we have a relatively stable female incarcerated population. We also have a relatively stable incarcerated population in general. But for women, we're just under 10 women for every 100,000 female residents. And that's how we in criminal justice calculate incarceration rates. How many people for every 100,000 residents is incarcerated? And so, again, between 1925 and 1975, we're at about 10 women for every 100,000 female residents. However, by the time we hit 2015, which is where this graphic ends, we're at nearly 70 women for every 100,000 residents. And so research tells us that that's approximately an 800% increase in a 40-year span between 1975 and 2015. So I want to zoom in on this area of growth just to give you a clearer picture. This graphic represents the raw number, so how many women are incarcerated as opposed to what is the rate of incarceration. And again, you'll see data from jail in yellow, state prisons in blue, and federal prisons in gray. But as you can tell, the growth in female incarceration is really pronounced when you zoom in on this era, which I'm going to refer to as our modern era. So that's just two graphics to give you an overview of the growth in female population, but it's also important to understand disparities. So when most people talk about mass incarceration, they talk about the whole number, the entire incarcerated population. What that doesn't show you is how people are affected differently based on their gender. So the numbers on the right-hand side are the most recent statistics we have from the Bureau of Justice, telling us that in 2019, there were 231,000 incarcerated women. In comparison, in 1970, there were only 8,000 incarcerated women. So in 1970, women made up 4% of the incarcerated population. In 2019, they made up 10% of the incarcerated population. So about a 2.5 times increase. But if you look at this graphic here on the left-hand upper corner, you'll notice that although we see growths in incarceration for men and women beginning in 1978 roughly, what you'll notice is that the female incarceration rate increases far more dramatically than the male incarceration rate. So the Prison Policy Initiative tells us that we saw approximately an 8-fold increase in female incarceration, so about 800%. And we saw a 5-fold increase in male incarceration, or about 500%. And in a few slides, I'll try to explain why that disparity exists. But important to note here is that we have 111,000 women in jail. So the female jail population is the largest population of women. But you'll also notice that we have 7,700 women housed in immigration detention facilities. That number is constantly in flux and constantly growing. But it's an area that we often don't talk about when we talk about incarceration. So there's gender disparities, but there's also racial and ethnic disparities. And so this first group of numbers is for all Black and Latino individuals. I use the terms African American and Hispanic because those are the terms that the official government reports use. I personally prefer Black and Latino for a whole host of reasons. But you'll notice that Blacks and Latinos comprise 32% of the US population, but they make up 56% of the incarcerated population. So they're incarcerated at much higher rates than their white counterparts, about 5 times the rate. Now that's for all Black and brown individuals. But if you look at just women, we also notice disparities. So Black and brown women, or Black and Latino women, are incarcerated at 2 times the rate of white women in the adult prison system. When we look at the juvenile justice system, we see similar disparities. So 35% of all incarcerated female juveniles are Black, and 19% of all incarcerated female juveniles are Latina or Hispanic. By comparison, only 38% of incarcerated juvenile females are women. And I say only because white girls make up closer to 60% of the juvenile female population outside of prison. So they're underrepresented in juvenile justice, while Black and Latino girls are overrepresented. So this is kind of just a brief overview of the problem. I want to talk about how we got here. So what are the policies and practices that led to this? Because a lot of people believe, well, if Black women and Latinas are highly represented in prisons, it must mean that they're committing more crime. The reality is that there's no research to support that idea. There are other things happening. And so what I want to focus on is really state policies, because the vast majority of the growth is happening at the state and at the local level. And I really want to hone in on 3 specific factors: drug charges, bail, and jail in general, and then women's experiences with abuse. So the war on drugs. Many of you are probably familiar with the war on drugs, but just like in class, I want to make sure everyone's on the same page. So I want to give you a brief history of the war on drugs and what it means and for the criminal justice system. So in 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson declared a war on crime. And that war on crime shifted our entire focus as a criminal justice system. We shifted away from rehabilitation, from trying to use incarceration as a means of, quote unquote, making someone better so that they can be released, and towards a tough on crime ideology. So we moved away from rehabilitation and towards more of what we criminologists called a warehousing model. You just stick people in prisons away from society, or kind of warehouse them separate, don't really focus on treatment. The war on crime is coupled 6 years later with Richard Nixon's 1971 declaration of a war on drugs. And together, the war on crime and the war on drugs give us modern mass incarceration. So in 1970, the US incarcerated 200,000 people in the entire country. By 1980, we were at 500,000. By 1989, we were at 1 million. And today we sit at 2.3 million incarcerated individuals, the largest incarcerated population in the world. So the US holds about 4.5% of the world's population, but we house 25% of the world's prison population. So we have a really huge incarceration rate, and a lot of it was driven by the war on drugs. However, while the war on drugs increased incarceration for everyone, it had a disparate impact on women. So in the 1980s and 1990s, drug convictions had the greatest effect on female prison population growth. In fact, it was the primary reason for female incarceration in the 1990s. During the 1980s, the estimated number of women in state prisons whose most serious charge was a drug crime, grew nearly tenfold, or 1,000%, from the 1970s. So research tells us that the war on drugs and drug charges account for about 40% of the growth in female state prison populations from 1980 into the 1990s. And so why is this? What is it about the war on drugs that disproportionately impacted women? Well, two things happened because of the war on drugs, or two things changed. One of them is law enforcement practices. The war on drugs shifted our resources away from treating drugs and drug addiction as a health problem and towards a more tough on crime, proactive targeting of certain neighborhoods and communities. And so what this meant was that law enforcement departments adopted quality of life or zero tolerance policies. What this meant is anyone breaking the law had to be arrested. The war on drugs took officers' discretion away. So officers on the street could no longer decide if they caught someone, let's say, with a joint of marijuana, could not make the decision to just take the drugs and give the person a warning. Now they had to arrest the person. But they had to arrest people for a wide variety of things besides drugs. They arrested people for loitering. So if you were hanging outside of a building for too long, the police arrested you. They arrested people for drinking outside, which for a long time was actually not criminalized. So we see a huge increase in police presence, largely in poor communities and communities of color. And so what this does is, because there's more police, there's simply a higher probability of being caught. And so according to a study from the Revere Institute of Justice, broken windows policing, or this zero tolerance policing, between 1989 and 2009 caused the arrest rate for drug possession for women to triple, while the arrest rate for men doubled. So we see a greater increase in the number of women being arrested than we do in the number of men being arrested for low-level drug charges, right? So for drug possession, not trafficking or some higher charge. And so research tells us that part of the reason we see this happening is that in the 80s and 90s, there was the misconception that male officers could not search females or women. And so a lot of their male family members who were engaged in the drug market had the women hold the drugs. Well, there is no law or a rule that says a male officer cannot search a female. Different departments have different policies, but there is no blanket rule that says a male officer cannot search a female. And so what ended up happening is the police did find these drugs. And a lot of the women ended up being arrested for possession or for possession with intent to distribute, which is drug dealing. And so we see this disparate impact on women because of policing practices. Add to that, changes in sentencing laws. And so according to the Revere Institute of Justice, between 1975 and 1995, all 50 states and the federal government reduced the amount of discretion available to sentencing judges. So we do not allow officers on the street level to use discretion. We also do not allow judges to use discretion. So a judge could not, have someone before them who was clearly substance addicted, could not send them to drug treatment the way they can today. They had to incarcerate them under what we call mandatory minimum laws. And so because of these two things, we see this disparate impact because of drug charges. And so it should come as no surprise that drug addiction and drug abuse amongst incarcerated women is higher than amongst incarcerated men. So the war on drugs is the biggest catalyst, but there are other factors, and jail and bail are a huge factor. Remember, nearly 50% of all women incarcerated are incarcerated at the local jail level, or 111,000 out of the 231,000. And women in jail constitute the fastest growing correctional population in the country. There was a 1,400% increase in the number of women in jail between 1970 and 2014. So what is it about jails that causes women to be incarcerated there at higher rates? Well, the leading cause of women incarcerated in jail is cash bail. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, incarcerated women have lower incomes than incarcerated men. Therefore, it's even harder for them to afford bail. And so I'll quote that report. It says, quote, Our research found that women who could not make bail had an annual median income of just $11,071. And among those women, Black women had a median annual income of only $9,083, or just 20% of the white male annual income. When the typical bail amount in this country is $10,000, right, which amounts to a full year's income, it's no wonder that women are stuck in jail awaiting trial, end quote. So we are placing $10,000 bail on women who make less than $10,000 in an entire year. So what the statistic means is that poor women are being incarcerated not because of the severity of their offense, right? Not because they did something violent or really bad, but simply because they're poor. If you think about it, a $500 cash bail to a single mother struggling to survive might as well be $5 million. They cannot afford it no matter what they do. If they could afford bail, they would not languish in prison, or in jail rather, while they await trial, which would dramatically alter their experience in the criminal justice system. Research tells us that people who are held pre-trial, who cannot afford bail and have to sit in jail, are more likely to receive a guilty verdict, and they're more likely to receive an incarcerated sentence because of that offense. So 2 people arrested for the same exact charge, both given $500 bail. One can afford it and goes home and awaits trial. The other cannot afford bail, so they're automatically incarcerated while they await trial. The one who could afford bail is going to receive a better sentence or a better deal than the person who is sitting in jail.
Jennifer, isn't it more likely that the person who is in jail and can't make bail will enter a guilty plea more frequently than someone who has access to bail and is on the outside? And isn't it also true that people who are incarcerated and can't make bail have a much more difficult time meeting with their attorneys and consequently preparing for a defense?
Absolutely. You're absolutely correct on both of those. So individuals who are held in jail pre-trial, they have to work around that correctional facility's visitation. So they're not able to access their lawyers frequently. Somebody who is outside is able to set up, one-on-one meetings with their lawyer at their convenience. But also individuals who are held in jail, they want to go home. So when the prosecutor comes to them after they've been sitting in jail for 6 months and says, hey, if you plead guilty, I will let you go home today, that person is going to accept that deal, whether or not they are guilty, just so that they can go home. And we know that individuals who are held pre-trial are more likely to be wrongfully convicted than those who are allowed out. So absolutely, yes, being in jail places pressure on people to accept plea bargains that they would not otherwise accept. Jail is also problematic because jails are designed for men. Keep in mind that 90% of the incarcerated population is men. So when states are constructing correctional facilities and deciding on services within correctional facilities, they are geared towards the needs of men. And yet women have different physical needs. So for example, they need reproductive health care. They need management of menopause. They need different nutritional requirements if they're pregnant, right? And they very often need substance abuse treatment. And the prison and jail system, healthcare systems are not built to meet these needs. So for example, many incarcerated women are required to purchase their own sanitary products because these products are not deemed essential hygiene items by the Department of Corrections because only 10% of their population actually needs it. So in 38 states, women do not have the right to have sanitary products given to them. They must purchase them. And so these are poor women. Many of them cannot afford to purchase those products from commissary inside of the prisons. So women incarcerated in jail, especially, are often left without menstrual products, which raises all types of physical and mental health concerns for that population. Add to that, this factor, which I argue is perhaps the most important factor for this entire conversation, is abuse, trauma, and mental health issues. Women are far more likely than men to enter prison with a history of abuse, trauma, and mental health problems. According to the Department of Justice, 73% of women in state prisons had a mental health problem. 3/4 of those women also met the criteria for substance abuse or addiction. More than 2/3 or 68% of women incarcerated had a history of physical or sexual abuse. A Vera Institute of Justice study found that 86% of incarcerated women had experienced sexual violence in their past. 77% had experienced intimate partner violence or domestic violence. And 60% had experienced violence at the hands of a caregiver, usually their parents, prior to their incarceration. In some states, that rate is even higher. So for example, research out of California tells us that 92% of all women incarcerated in California prisons have been battered and abused at some point in their lifetime. These rates are still even higher when you look at jails. 98% of women in jails report having been exposed to some trauma in their lifetime. So these women have high rates of trauma, and the criminal justice system actually doesn't help them address or deal with any of this trauma, and can often, the criminal justice system actually criminalizes these women's responses to abuse. So for example, young girls who are running away from sexually and physically abusive homes, once they're arrested for running away, which is a crime if you're a juvenile, they're formally processed into the juvenile justice system, and often they're returned back to the very same homes in which they were being abused, right? Which opens them up to additional abuse. Adult women face similar issues. For example, there's a growing trend for something called dual arrests for domestic violence cases. So many jurisdictions are passing laws where officers responding to domestic violence calls must arrest all involved parties. So a woman who is being beaten by her husband or partner who calls the police will be arrested with her partner, because the idea is that the courts can just figure it out. What this means, however, is that women who are experiencing abuse are not going to call the police because they don't want to have to enter jail, right? To be re-traumatized as a result of these dual arrest laws. Furthermore, when abused women and girls do escape their abusers, they often turn to what we call survival crime. And these are crimes that people commit to feed themselves, to clothe themselves, literally to survive, to have basic needs. And the two most common forms of crime amongst women is prostitution and theft. And if you think about it, an abused woman escapes, she turns to prostitution as her means of making money. She's then arrested, processed into the system, and now she has a felony record, right? And so many of these women who are trying to deal with abuse often turn to substances or drugs to self-medicate. And I put self-medicate in quotation marks. I know the medical field really hates that term because taking illegal narcotics is not really medicating a problem. But these women are self-medicating, right? They are using drugs to escape what's happening to them. And so research tells us about 74% of all incarcerated women have a drug or alcohol problem. So they enter prisons with high rates of abuse, trauma, and mental health, and sadly, very few of them receive any treatment during their incarceration. So according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, less than half of women in state prisons with a history of substance abuse receive any treatment during their incarceration. And less than 1 in 4 women, or 25%, with severe psychiatric disorders receive any mental health services during their incarceration. So they're coming in with these issues. They've turned to drugs in order to deal with the issue, and then when they enter prison, they're not receiving any treatment. So that's kind of—
Jennifer, isn't it true that many of the women who are incarcerated now are in our county jails across the country, and because of the nature of the circumstances in jails, the facilities and capability of providing mental health assistance is much more limited than it would be even in a correctional facility?
Absolutely, and I think that's a really important distinction. So jail stays are generally very short. We're averaging about 17 days is the average jail stay nationwide. Prisons, people go to prison if they're serving 1 year or more. So many jails do not provide services because most programs are 6 months long, or at least a minimum of 6 months. And so jails often have little to no programming at all to treat these, because they view people as, short-term stays. They'll be out in a few weeks. And so it is easier to receive treatment in prison than it is jail. But nearly 50% of women are in jail, and they will not, and many of them will never enter a prison. They will serve their time in jail or go home directly from jail, so they're not going to receive those treatments at all. Absolutely. And so that's kind of my three main factors. There were other factors discussed in the literature, but these are three of the biggest ones, and areas I think that we can help as a community. But I don't want to neglect the impact on the family. Incarceration leads to substantial family disruption. Today, an estimated 2.7 million American children have at least one incarcerated parent, at least one parent behind bars. So 11.4% of Black children, 3.5% of Latino children, and 1.8% of white children have at least one parent incarcerated. So the percentage among the Black population of children is 6 times higher than the percentage amongst white children. So Black children and Latino children are more likely to have an incarcerated parent behind bars. This is problematic when you look at mothers. So 62% of incarcerated women in prisons were mothers of minor children. 80% of women incarcerated in jails were mothers of minor children. And these women were far more likely than the fathers to have been primary caretakers of their children at the time of their arrest. So by increasing these women, we're seeing more and more family disruption and insecurity. A woman who's facing incarceration has two choices. She either finds a family member who's willing to support her children during her incarceration, which again, these are already poor families, so taking on extra children is very difficult. If she can't find a family member to take her children, she'll have to turn her children over to the state foster care system. And so children experience trauma as a result of their mother's incarceration, both in losing her, but many of them enter the foster care system as well. And so these incarcerated women try their best to keep in contact with their children. If you speak to incarcerated women, they will overwhelmingly tell you that their primary concern is reuniting with their children. However, when they're incarcerated, there's very little face-to-face contact between women and children. And that's because there are less women incarcerated, only 10% of the population, the majority of facilities are male-only facilities. So women are more likely to be incarcerated really far from their homes. So for example, if I were to, God forbid, be arrested here in Floyd County, Indiana, which is in southern Indiana, I would likely be housed, once I'm sentenced, in the Indiana Women's Prison, which is just over 2 hours north of me. So it would make my family have to take a 4-hour round trip to visit me for 1 hour a week. And while my family could probably afford that, the average family of an incarcerated woman cannot afford the gas and the time to actually make that trip. So we see weakening of the bond between mother and child because of the lack of face-to-face contact. Now, a lot of women who are incarcerated try to make up for this through phone calls. However, prison phone calls are very expensive. For example, in the state of Maine, a 15-minute phone call from a Maine Department of Corrections prison costs $5.30. That's a lot of money for a family that is struggling. Now, because the majority of women are housed in jail, communication is made even more difficult because jail phone calls are 3 times as expensive as prison phone calls. And that's because there is no one body that sets the cost of making phone calls. Every state, every jurisdiction is essentially setting their own rates based on their provider. And so 1 in every 3 incarcerated women surveyed by the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights found that families were actually entering into debt in order to afford phone calls from prison. So once they entered enough debt, they were left with little choice but to eliminate contact between the mother and the children altogether. To make matters worse, women who place their children in foster care because they don't have a family member who could care for their children, they run the risk of having their family ties severed permanently. In many states, a woman serving a prison sentence longer than 15 months can have her parental rights terminated without her knowledge or consent. So she places the children in foster care because she has no choice, and then she finds out upon her release that they're no longer her children, that they've been adopted out to another family, and all of her rights have been terminated. And the state has that right in many jurisdictions.
Jennifer, I know we hear a lot about the cradle to prison pipeline or school to prison pipeline and the kind of the cycle oftentimes in family situations and with family dynamics. But one of the statistics I think I heard, and tell me if I'm correct in this, that a child who has an adult in his or her family who has been incarcerated is about 10 times more likely to be incarcerated during some time in his or her life. Is that close to being accurate?
Absolutely. Research consistently tells us that children who have an incarcerated parent are more likely to face incarceration themselves. Part of that is attributed to the trauma that they experience, having their parent taken from them and incarcerated, not having that same social bond and relationship during those crucial nurturing and growing points of their life. But also, these very same children come from impoverished areas, and they face even more poverty once their mother is incarcerated. So they start off at a disadvantage, and their mother's incarceration places them at an even greater disadvantage. And the mother's, or female incarceration rather, further impacts the family financially. So as this graphic indicates, 2 out of every 3 families with an incarcerated loved one struggle through financial difficulties as a result of that incarceration. Keep in mind that mothers are more likely to be the primary caregivers. So those families are dependent on the mothers for finances, for this money. And so you'll see that nearly 1 in 5 families could not afford their housing after their loved one became incarcerated, and so they faced eviction. Even before incarceration, these families are significantly disadvantaged. So 72% of incarcerated women earned less than $22,000 a year prior to their incarceration. They're only making $22,000 a year. Minimum wage of $7.25 comes out to $15,080. So they're slightly above minimum wage, but at $22,000, a family of 3 is considered below the poverty level. That is really problematic when you consider this next slide. Arrest and conviction are generally coupled with really high court-related costs. As this graphic indicates, on average, families paid $13,670 in court-related costs. Now, keep in mind, the average woman in prison is making $11,000 a year. And nearly 3/4 are making $22,000 or less. $13,000 is an impossible amount of debt for somebody making that small amount of money. And as you'll see, 83% of family members who are responsible for these costs are women. So the burden is shifted onto women to pay these costs. And so 1 in 5 families reported actually taking out a loan to cover these costs. They barely have enough funds to keep their family afloat. The court's asking for $13,000. They may take out a loan to cover that amount. Now here's the problem. These are poor individuals with very little income. And so they're not eligible for a loan from Chase Bank, for example. They would have to take out loans from predatory lenders, what people call payday lenders. What payday lenders do is they prey on poor people. So poor people need money. They cannot access banks because of their credit score, their income, because they don't have a bank account. And so they end up borrowing from companies that charge them 300%, 400%, 500% interest. So a family borrowing $13,000 to pay off court costs is probably going to pay closer to $35,000 back to that predatory lender. So they're already poor, and these loans place them at even more disadvantage. Now, the financial problems families face pre-incarceration and during incarceration continue long after their family member comes home. And there's several reasons for that. One is the impact of a criminal record. So individuals with criminal records are 50% less likely to receive a job than people without a criminal record. This disparity is worse for people of color. A now famous study by the late Harvard sociologist Deborah Pazer found that people of color without criminal records were less likely to receive a job than white people with a criminal record. So people of color are not only facing the stigma of a criminal record, but they're facing the stigma of being a person of color when they go apply for a job. And as you'll see here, 79% of formerly incarcerated women were unable to afford housing after their release. So it's perhaps no surprise that formerly incarcerated women experience homelessness at higher rates than men. And they're more likely to be primary caregivers, so their children are also experiencing homelessness with them. So how do we fix all of this? There are many scholars advocating for reforming the criminal justice system's treatment of women and girls. And I'm sure many of you are wondering how you can help address the problem. I believe there are two main things that all of us can do to help address this problem. The first, I argue, is perhaps the most important, and that's gender responsive programming. I believe that we need gender responsive programming at all levels of society. We must acknowledge that women are experiencing high rates of victimization that contribute to their drug use and engagement in crime. And then we have to work to develop programs that address these issues. And so I advocate for trauma-informed care throughout our society. So we need to give young girls a space, young girls and women, a space to talk about what they've been through. The juvenile justice system and the criminal justice system often re-traumatizes them. So I think it's on us, those of us doing this work, and those of us who care about this issue, to develop programs early on, whether that's in the school system, whether that's in your church, wherever it is that you can, but creating a space where young girls can come tell someone what they're going through before they enter the juvenile justice system. But we must also create gender responsive programming within juvenile justice. So much like the adult system, the juvenile justice system caters to boys, and it treats the needs of girls and boys as identical. And this is problematic given everything that I've covered so far. While boys and girls both experience abuse, girls experience it at higher rates, and they continue to experience it through adulthood. So if you're currently operating a program of any kind, I ask you to reassess the gender responsivity of your program. Is the programming the same for everyone? And if it is that truly the most effective means of providing treatment? Are you addressing the unique needs of women and girls? If you're a criminal justice practitioner, I implore you to read the existing literature on gender responsive programming and determine whether your agency is capable of developing a program just for women. And if you're not operating a program right now, contact your local jail and see if you can volunteer in the jail to offer programming. Many jails need programming, but they just cannot afford to hire someone to actually give the programming. So they're generally very receptive to volunteers. In the development of your program, however, be sure that the programs don't operate under sexist ideals. Many female facilities offer cooking and parenting classes as the sole programming for women, which kind of assumes that the women are going to exit back into the 1950s, and they're just going to go and they're just going to be mothers and homemakers, that they're not going to enter the workforce, which we know is not true, right? These women are the primary caregivers, so we must prepare them for the workforce in the same way that we do men. And we also need to create gender responsive reentry programming. Instead of trying to make existing programs for men fit women, we need to create female specific programs. And if anyone's interested in gender responsive reentry programming or programming in general, I just wrote an article on this topic, and I'm willing to share it with anyone who wants to read it. But the second major area for reform is policy. While I don't want to go off on a political tangent here, we must be aware that criminal justice policies are developed by politicians who have little to no experience with the criminal justice system. So for that reason, it's our responsibility, those of us with the knowledge, the social capital, the political capital, and the financial capital, to advocate for policy reform. And so I advocate for three things that I believe will reduce mass incarceration in general, but specifically within the female population. And they are the decriminalization of drugs, which is different than the legalization. Decriminalizing means we just don't put people in jail for it anymore. We create alternatives like drug courts and treatment programs. Sentencing reform is crucial, and it must include the elimination of mandatory minimum sentences. Judges must have the discretion to determine if prison or jail is really the best fit for that person. And then we need the implementation of bail reform. I advocate for the elimination of cash bail altogether. So how do we do these things, right? How do we begin to advocate for policy reform? Well, the first thing is to contact your local and state representatives, local, state, and federal representatives. Call them, write them letters, protest if you must, but make your voice heard. We vote them in, and we have the power to demand things from them. And I know that in the past decade, it has seemed like we can't demand things, like we don't have power. But I believe that we do. And so there's a famous quote by Alice Walker, which I have hanging in my office. And she said, the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. And so I think our collective voices are very powerful. A legislature may ignore one letter, but he or she is not going to ignore 1,000 letters or 100 letters. Just ask the state of New Jersey and California, two states where advocates were successful in eliminating cash bail altogether for all accused individuals. If you really want to make your voices heard, you can set up things like postcard parties, or given COVID-19, some virtual postcard party where you all get together and you write postcards or letters to your elected officials. Support politicians who support criminal justice reform. Check a person's voting record before you vote for them. See if they truly represent your views. And then you can support organizations that are working for these reforms. So for example, the Bail Project is a national organization that raises funds to bail people out who have small bail amounts, usually under $5,000. Donate to them if you can. If you can't donate, then dedicate your birthday on a social media site to a specific organization and ask others to donate on your behalf. You can do this for your birthday, you can do this for Christmas. And if you can't afford to donate, then volunteer. Organizations working on these issues are usually nonprofits. They're underfunded, understaffed, and desperately in need of help. So dedicate your time. In 2018, I made my New Year's resolution to dedicate 100 hours of service to a variety of organizations. It's actually how I came to be part of Mission Behind Bars and Beyond. I signed up for their mentor training, went to the training one day, started mentoring women, and slowly got to know the board members of MB3. And here I am in 2020, a board member. I get to create real change and connect with the who's who of reentry in this area. So donate time. 100 hours a year is less than 2 hours a week. This year in 2020, before COVID, my goal was 300 hours, but unfortunately that's all kind of been hindered at this point. And then lastly, spread knowledge. If each of you who attended today shares what you learned with 3 people, we can begin to educate the masses, which I think is crucial for any social movement or for any reform to happen. So teach people, tell everyone, and spread the word so we can begin to undo some of this damage together. And so this next slide is, I think you've taken control, Monica, and I can't go back now. This slide is my references. When you get this PowerPoint, you can click on any of those blue words. It will take you directly to each report that I cited in this presentation. They're all free and available to the public.
Jennifer, I want to go back to the policy issues. One of the things that I remember that came out of the war on drugs was the punishment of people who have been convicted of drug offenses, not only by placing them into incarceration, but also restricting their ability to access benefits. I mean, isn't it still true that if, in fact, you've been convicted of a drug-related felony, that you're ineligible for public housing and other public assistance programs? And doesn't that dramatically and disproportionately affect women?
Absolutely. And so having a felony record, there are an estimated 40,000 laws or restrictions placed on felons nationwide. So having a felony record can bar you from a whole host of things, including public housing, but it can also ban you from licensing. So for example, if you were the barber in prison or the beautician in prison, when you come out in many jurisdictions, you cannot get a license to actually practice cosmetology or being a barber. So we see significant roadblocks. We call these collateral consequences of having a criminal record. But yes, they are barred from living in public housing, and then they can't get jobs, which contributes to their rate of homelessness. And so I am done with my part. Monica will lead our question and answer.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jennifer, so much critical information to help us, one, understand the realities that have been before us and continue to be before us, but also ways in which we can tangibly get involved, use our time, our talents, our influence to make a difference in people's lives. At this time, you see Jennifer's information there, her contact information, so please feel free to utilize that if you have specific questions offline. But we want to take this moment to look at go for our Q&A. There was a question that came through that says, what role does the for-profit prison system play in these issues?
That is excellent. And I can go off on a whole tangent on for-profit prisons, but I'll try to keep this short and sweet. For-profit prisons are institutions run by for-profit corporations, so they're openly traded on our stock market. And they contribute to this growing problem because they have what are known as occupancy clauses in their contracts. So when a corporation negotiates with a state, what they do is they hide in these occupancy clauses. And what this means is if the jail or prison drops below a certain occupancy level, it triggers a fine. So the state owes the corporation usually millions of dollars because their prison population is below that capacity clause. And keep in mind that these capacity clauses are usually like 95% and higher. In many states like Arizona, they're 100%. So if a single bed is empty, that triggers a fine. What this means is states have to incarcerate people in order to avoid losing millions of dollars. And so oftentimes they will increase arrests within a jurisdiction to ensure the prison population remains at 100%. Alternatively, what they'll do is they will transfer inmates from public prisons into private prisons, even if the prison is much further away from their home. So that's going to affect visitation as well.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit to that. One, that our next webinar in July is going to address the problem of private prisons and immigration detention centers. But the reality is when we understand that there's a lack of programming that's available for women in particular, but also men. It costs to provide programming unless you can get volunteers to come in. And in private prisons, they're actually working toward making a profit. So the additional costs of other types of services and programming are dramatically reduced in order to keep their profit margin high. So the reality of that is that for people who are incarcerated in private prisons and immigration detention centers, they're getting much less service than people who are in state-run programs.
That's a great point, Dean, because public prisons are answerable to the taxpayer that funds them. Private prisons are answerable to their shareholders, to that stock market. So they have to show that they're making more money every quarter in order to give out dividends to their stockholders. So they're going to cut all the programming. They don't allow their correctional officers to unionize. They don't accept high-risk individuals. So people suffering from severe mental health issues generally cannot be placed in private prisons because they don't want to provide them treatment. And so research tells us that people who exit private prisons are more likely to reoffend than people who exit public prisons.
Great. Our next question is, would you say that the rate of homelessness due to the restriction of help through the state only further contributes to the criminalization of these individuals due to even more cases of crimes for survival or homelessness being criminalized in and of itself?
Absolutely. It is a very, very vicious cycle. So you make a mistake or you're on drugs, and you're arrested and it's your first felony offense, now you're excluded from housing, not just public housing. Many private landlords will not rent to someone who has a felony record, which, being from New York City, was a big surprise to me when I moved here to Indiana, that I had to do a criminal background check in order to rent a home. But what this means is that they are more likely to be homeless. Once you're homeless, many jurisdictions have criminalized the very act of being homeless. So sleeping outside, you can be arrested for it. And so then you're placed into jail, and you're released a few days later, and you still don't have anywhere to go. So you're back sleeping on the same streets, and you're arrested again, and it becomes a very, very vicious cycle. I think that lifting restrictions on public housing, but I also think making it illegal to discriminate against someone because of a record would dramatically decrease homelessness amongst the formerly incarcerated population.
Excellent. I have a couple of questions, as many of the folks on our, a part of our group are church leaders or engaged in the faith-based community. So these kind of go together. One is there any way churches can be helpful with working with prisoners, and meaning churches that are healthy and not fundamentalist or judgmental? Secondly, and to that point, hypothetical, if I'm a pastor of a small church, mostly older members, mostly Caucasian, what is the best way to introduce this issue and invite members to get involved?
I think churches can help in so many ways. And I'll be honest with you, I think some of the greatest programming I've seen inside of jails and prisons is coming from the faith-based community. I would say contacting your local facility and asking them what is and isn't allowed. So for example, in my town, in the county next to mine, I can enter their jail and I can offer programming. When I contacted the jail commander and said, hey, can I create what do I need to do in order to create a reentry program for your population? He said, show up and show it to me. And I did. And he was really open about it and let me speak to about 15 incarcerated persons at a time. So I would say contacting the jails. If you're already in the jails, like if you're providing prison ministry, if at all possible, to have a female minister instead of the female pod or unit is really helpful. I think women are more comfortable talking about sexual and physical trauma with women than with men. And so including women in your volunteer population, but especially within your within people offering pastoral services can be really helpful. So for example, MB3 has a female pastor at Dismissed Charities at the Dearson House. The New Life in Christian Church is run by a female pastor at an all-female facility. I think that's very helpful. I think the women feel more comfortable talking to her than most other people. Donate things. So we have an organization here called Exit Zero, and they go into the jail every Christmas and they give every incarcerated person a Christmas package that includes socks, a t-shirt, basic necessities. Contact your local jail and ask them whether you can donate sanitary products to be made available for free to these women. Jails usually argue that they lack the resources, the financial ability to actually do these things. Donating stuff may help them provide these services. As far as being a largely all-white congregation, I don't think it matters the racial makeup of your congregation in terms of receiving this information. If your church feels uncomfortable about it or wants a deeper understanding of racial disparity, I can provide tons of resources and places where they can go look and kind of read up on their own. If you're going into correctional facilities that are largely have populations of color, you have to be willing to ask questions. You have to be willing to learn about their cultures, and you have to put aside any biases or misconceptions you have or views of the world and try to view the world through their eyes. The hardest thing to do is putting aside your own worldview and trying to understand a person, meet them where they are, is a big thing that we push with Mission Behind Bars. It's not our job to tell them how to live their lives or what they should be doing. It's our job, at least in my opinion, to help them. to show them the power of faith through our own practices, not by trying to push faith onto them. And so I'm a person of deep faith. But when I talk to an incarcerated or formerly incarcerated person, I talk to them about what they need first, what it is that they're facing, what their fears are. And then through the work I'm willing to do for them, I show them the power of faith. But I don't, I think, and I don't mean this to be offensive to anyone, but I think a lot of people go into prisons and jails and it's very much a, accept Christ or else type of approach. And that kind of aggression doesn't really work with these people, right? They want to see tangible help and assistance. And in providing that, I think you can draw them closer to some sense of faith.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit to that because there are many programs already in existence that churches can affiliate with. Mission Behind Bars is one of them, and one of the things that we encourage is not only going inside and meeting people and developing a relationship with them, but also walking alongside them when they leave. There are not too many churches that have reentry programs that continue to provide support when people leave places of incarceration. And statistics show that during that first year is the highest rate of recidivism of people going back into prisons and jails. And so having a support group there initially when people leave is invaluable. And we've experienced a reduction in the recidivism rate when we can place somebody coming out of prison or jail with a support group that we've trained. Starting a prison congregation is another thing that it could be accessed by congregations, particularly in areas that are close to a prison or jail. And there's a program called Prison Congregations of America that can help you actually begin a conversation with the prison and jail authorities about starting a congregation actually inside those facilities. And then the last thing I want to mention is that it's part of our responsibility as Christians to actually care for those who are in prison and who are on the margins and who have often been abandoned and forgotten about. One of the things that we're doing right now, because we can't go back into the prisons because of COVID-19, is that we've invited people to write notes of encouragement to people who are incarcerated, just to remember them, to give them a sense of hope and a sense that there are people on the outside who remember that they're on the inside. So there's a lot of different ways of becoming involved in this type of work. The National Benevolent Association Prison and Jail Ministries page has a lot of resources that are available for viewing and also accessing and downloading. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that as well.
Thank you both. We are just about at our time, but I'm also mindful of the context in which we are currently living of COVID-19. And so I don't want to miss the opportunity. If either of you have any insight or quick pictures that you can paint of the impact of COVID-19 on the prison system, and in particular, our conversation around women that are incarcerated, and then we'll close out our time together.
So I will say that infectious diseases thrive in prison. These are closed, cramped quarters. They're usually very filthy. There's a lack of access to cleaning products. Many of them have old ventilation systems. I mean, Auburn Correctional Facility in New York was built in the 1800s. It gives you any idea of what the ventilation system must look like in that prison. And so all infectious diseases have much higher rates inside of prison. So the rate of tuberculosis is 17 times higher in prison than it is outside. And so we should expect the same with COVID-19. It is spreading very, very quickly. There are those of us, myself included, who are advocating for letting people out of prison in vast numbers. So one thing that you can do tomorrow or today after this, you can call the Commissioner of Corrections in your state and demand that they release low-level, non-violent individuals because of COVID. Just to give you some, good news, we've been successful in releasing thousands of incarcerated people just in the past 30 days. New York has released 1,100, Florida 1,000, Illinois 700, California 3,500, Kentucky 900, and New Jersey 1,000, and that's just some of them. But if we don't start releasing low-level individuals who do not need to be incarcerated in the first place, we are going to see 97% of people will leave a jail or prison. They're not serving life sentences. So they're going to come out with COVID, and we're going to see new cases of this if we don't start to really address the incarcerated population. We've got hundreds of, or at least dozens of deaths so far. I mean, the Cook County Jail's got 500 cases by itself. And if we don't do something, what's happening inside of prisons and jail is going to affect all of us, especially when you consider that the prison population is aging dramatically. The percentage of inmates over the age of 55 increased 1,500% in the past 30 years because of those long prison sentences. So this is an older population, puts them at higher risk of dying from COVID, and we need to be the advocates to ensure that nobody forgets the incarcerated population during all of this.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you, Dean. And for all of you, thank you. This does end our webinar, but we appreciate the time that you took out of your day to be with us, to learn more about these important issues, and in particular, what we can be doing, even from our homes, to support, encourage, and uplift our communities and our brothers and sisters who are incarcerated. Please consider the many ways that you and your congregation might get involved and further your ministries in addressing prison and jail related issues overall. Today's webinar, as I mentioned earlier, has been recorded and will be up on the NBA website. So please share this resource with others. NBA hosts regular websites with topics related to prison and jail ministries, mental health and wellness, social entrepreneurship, and leadership and organizational development for health and social service ministries throughout the year. So please check also our website for upcoming educational opportunities and registration. If you want to be further connected to our work, please feel free to email Dean, our mission specialist, at prisonministries@nbacares.org, or you can visit the NBA Cares website, nbacares.org/prison-and-jail. Like us on NBA, like NBA on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter and Instagram. We are so grateful for you. Stay safe and have a great day.